Thanks very much for coming along this evening. As we were noting just before we began formally that for those of you who are interested in football, one of whom is me, the England game is on this evening, so thank you for coming. With a bit of luck, we'll finish just before kick-off, but you will have to make your own arrangements if you want to watch the game. My name is Alasdair. I am the Outreach Officer for the Houses of Parliament for London and the South East of England. I was having a little chat with one of the attendees just before we started about outreach. We've been around since about 2009, and we work to let people know more about Parliament and how it works with a view to increasing public engagement with Parliament. And as a result, we work with people from all different backgrounds. We work with voluntary sector, charities, business, universities, and indeed people with a political interest as well. So although the Fabians Society is an affiliated body, we've worked with all different kinds of political bodies in the past. And my background is that I've worked in the Houses of Parliament since 2001. I was a Hansard reporter, and I started in 2001 and moved to Outreach in 2009. Prior to that, I was a teacher at a sixth form college in South London. This evening we're going to be talking to you about legislation. Now, in Outreach, we very usually, when we do these sort of sessions, they're really much an overview, an introduction to how Parliament works. That's a very typical session for us. And we do actually do a drop-in session every couple of months here, and if you're interested or you have colleagues or friends who are interested, the next one's on July the 3rd. But Alex asked me to do something quite specific, which was that he wanted to look at how Parliament handles finance matters, specifically the budget, the finance bill, and how that differs from the way that bills are dealt with on a usual basis in Parliament. So what I'm going to be talking to you about for the next sort of 15-20 minutes is what I suspect will be for most of you a recap of the typical way in which Parliament deals with legislation. So it will be very much just a sort of a canter through the general process of a bill becoming an act. After that, my colleague Dominic Webb from the library will be talking to you in a bit more detail about the finance bill itself and how Parliament deals with money bills. And we will hopefully be joined at about 7:10 by Simon Patrick of the Public Bill Office. And he will be talking a little bit about how the current finance bill is being handled and some of the sort of specific matters of process that he has to deal with in the Public Bill Office. As I was alluding to just now, if you've got any questions while I'm talking, please do fire away. And I know that Dominic and Simon are going to build in some time for questions when they talk as well. So hopefully there'll be lots of opportunities for you to ask the questions you want to ask. So when you're talking about legislation in Parliament, I should say, even before we start talking about what's on this slide, you'll be aware that bills can be generated by individual MPs. There are such things as private members' bills. Only about 9% of private members' bills will ever reach the statute book. So the vast bulk of legislation that becomes law in this country through the House of Parliament is government legislation. If people are seeking to influence the process of government legislation, there are many ways they can think about doing that before it's even officially begun its stages in Parliament. And I'll talk you through those official stages in a moment. So one of the first sort of hints or inkling that the public might have that the government are going to pass a particular piece of legislation might be a green paper. No doubt some of you have come across green papers. These are government documents. They're nothing to do with Parliament. The government, if they want to, can create a green paper. They're under no obligation to do so. And it will usually set out some broad policy ideas, very often attached to some sort of consultation process. A white paper is far closer to what the final bill will be. It's usually much, much closer to the final bill. Again, the government, if they want to, can create a consultation process around a white paper. The government can create a consultation process on its own. It doesn't need to be attached to a green paper or a white paper. And you'll be aware that, for instance, at the moment the government are consulting on whether to legalise gay marriage. There's no green paper or white paper involved, it's simply a consultation process. All of this is in the government's hands. Parliament has no role in it, has no say in it. There's nothing stopping MPs and members of the Lords asking questions about green papers and white papers to ministers, but Parliament doesn't deal with them in any formal way. The first time that Parliament would have anything to do with the lawmaking process would be a pre-legislative committee, or some kind of pre-legislative scrutiny. These pre-legislative scrutiny does not always happen. Again, it is very much in the gift of the government. And it will happen if the government creates a draft bill. So the Queen's Speech this year, we had announced a draft care and support bill. When that draft bill is published, Parliament will automatically subject it to pre-legislative scrutiny. But Parliament can't just decide to do that. It can only do that if their draft bill is published. When a draft bill is published, Parliament will either set up an ad hoc committee to look at that bill in the manner of pre-legislative scrutiny, or the bill will be given to an extant select committee to look at. So if it was a transport bill, the transport committee might look at it. Whether it's an ad hoc committee or a select committee, they will look at it in the standard select committee fashion. They will conduct an inquiry. They will take public written evidence, they will take public oral evidence. They will produce a report which the government must respond to. Now, governments don't generally produce draft bills unless they're actually interested in building in some of the ideas in those reports. And the previous government, the Labour government, for instance, introduced a marine bill during the most recent term of office. And that actually spent a whole year going through consultation, going through pre-legislative scrutiny, because it was a very big bill and the government wanted to get the detail right. And of course, people can talk to individual MPs and members of the House of Lords and get them to ask questions about government proposals at any time. During the first year of the coalition government, 2 different government proposals were sort of defeated, if you like, simply because people were asking lots of very difficult questions about them in the House of Commons and in the House of Lords. And that was the proposals to create anonymity for those accused of rape, and also the proposals to privatise nationally owned woodland. In both cases, the government had announced they were thinking of doing something. They hadn't published a bill, but MPs and members of the Lords, very often prompted by campaigning groups and constituents, sort of knocked that into the long grass. And the example there is just one of the reasons why it's very important to get the drafting of legislation correct. No one shall carry any dangerous weapon upon the public highway, except for the purposes of killing a noxious animal or a policeman in the execution of his duty. So they need to know where to put the commas. That's the Health and Social Care Bill from last year, now the Health and Social Care Act. This, by the way, is from the Parliament website. Any bill, including the Finance Bill, can be tracked through the Parliament website. You can find the bill, any proposed amendments to it, House of Commons and House of Lords Library briefing documents. You can also get an email alert letting you know when the bill has gone to its next stage. Bills can begin their life in the House of Commons or in the House of Lords. If a bill begins its life in the House of Lords, it's usually a more consensual bill. There's usually a sense that there's more consensus agreement on it. The reason for that is, if the government want to force a bill through using the Parliament Act, and some of you might have heard of that, the bill must begin its life in the Commons. If the bill begins its life in the House of Lords, it cannot be forced through using the Parliament Act. I'll talk a bit more about the Parliament Act later. Most contentious legislation begins its life in the House of Commons. Flagship bills, contentious bills, will begin their lives in the House of Commons as a rule of thumb. Not always, but nearly always. The Finance Bill always begins its life in the House of Commons, and that's because the House of Lords has very restricted voting rights over the Finance Bill, and Dominic and Simon will no doubt say a little bit about that later. So let's, for instance, take a typical bill that starts in the House of Commons. Think about the Health and Social Care Bill, maybe not such a typical bill, but let's take a bill that starts its life in the House of Commons. So these are the different stages that the bill will go through. First reading is a formality. If you watch a first reading of a bill in the House of Commons, it really is sort of blink and you'll miss it. Someone stands up, reads the title of the bill out, they set a date for second reading, that's it. The point of first reading is it's the point of publication of the bill. This is when the bill is a real bill, it's not a draft bill anymore. And that announcement at first reading is an announcement to the members of the House that the bill is ready for them to go away and study and read. And 2 weeks later, usually, the bill will come back on second reading. Second reading is the first opportunity that members have to debate the main principles of the bill. People are not in the business of suggesting changes or amendments at this point. It's a general debate about the principles of the bill. A vote can be taken on whether the bill proceeds. If the government were to lose that vote, it could trigger a vote of no confidence. The government needs to be able to get its own legislation through the House of Commons, or it doesn't have the confidence of the House. So it's very unusual, hardly ever heard of, a bill that would be defeated on second reading. The bill moves from second reading, it goes on into the committee stage. Typically, that means being heard by a public bill committee. Public bill committee, quite different from a select committee, between about 16 or 50 MPs. The ratio of MPs is fixed by the ratio of MPs in the Commons, so the government will have an inbuilt majority. Unlike a select committee, the members are selected by party whips. So the members on public bill committees are loyal members. There are no sort of naughty boys or girls on public bill committees, particularly not on the government side, because the government want to get their bill through. Members can suggest changes. All members can suggest changes in the public bill committee, but the government have that majority to make sure they get their own way. It says here knives may be used. Now that makes public bill committees sound a lot more exciting than they actually are. What it means is that the bill must reach a certain point at certain stages. So if the committee, for instance, were to last for 4 weeks, by the end of week 1, they may decide that they must have reached up to clause 12. By the end of week 2, up to clause 30, and so on and so on. If the committee does not reach clause 12 at the end of the first week, any clauses it hasn't talked about are just put to a straight vote, yes or no. So many bills don't get detailed scrutiny, as detailed scrutiny as members might like in committee. Now, a lot of people wonder, what's the purpose of public bill committees then? Well, one of the things that does happen, although opposition amendments don't typically get accepted in bill committees, what will frequently happen is that a minister will say, that's a very interesting idea, we'll go away, we'll have a look at that, and we'll come back on reports. Now, some years ago, when I was a Hansard reporter, Dawn Primrolo was the Paymaster General. She was in charge of HMRC. And there was a Conservative MP, some of you might have heard of, called Howard Flight. Howard Flight was a renowned expert in tax law, and on more than one occasion, Public Bill Committee on the Finance Bill, I observed Howard Flight bring in amendments which the government subsequently brought back themselves on reports. So what you would frequently see is someone like Dawn Primrolo saying, well, that's a very interesting idea the Honourable Gentleman has, we'll go away, we'll have a look at it, we'll come back on reports. And what that means in plain English is it's a great idea, we wish we'd thought of it, and we will do it on report. And that happens quite a lot. So with some of those technical aspects of legislation or unintended consequences, the government actually listen a lot more at public bill committee stage than people realise. When it comes down to matters of principle about the bill, then the government are a lot more stubborn. Report stage takes place in the House of Commons itself. Now it's worth noting, and we'll talk about this a bit later, that some parts of committee stage might happen on the floor of the House of Commons, a committee of the whole House, and that definitely applies to bits of the finance bill, but that will come up later. The report stage always takes place on the floor of the House of Commons, and the amount of time devoted to it has actually increased in recent years. It used to be about 3 or 4 hours and 1 day. Now it's about 6 over 2 days. At this point, any MP can suggest an amendment. In committee stage, only members of the committee can do that. At report stage, any MP can put an amendment forward. Obviously, those 6 hours is not that long, especially if a bill is large. So, report stage, even though they've doubled the length of it, still very often bills are not getting the full scrutiny that perhaps members might like. Yes?
Is it the Speaker that determines how long each bill gets debated for at the report stage?
In the House of Commons, even at report stage, all of the change that I just mentioned, that was really agreed by the current government whips. The government really have a very tight control on how much time is spent on bills in the House of Commons.
Who determines which amendments are debated?
Very good question. In the committee stage, it would be the chair of the committee. On report, it would be the Speaker. But I have to say, the chair of the committee and the Speaker would be talking quite closely to the government whips in those discussions.
Say, for example, Labour weren't happy with a particular bill. Would they, if they wanted more time for debate, would they go to the Speaker? Could he theoretically make more time? Because governments are elected to enact a legislative platform,
the Speaker's powers in sort of restricting how much time they have to do their own legislation are pretty limited. The Leader of the House's office is much more powerful in that regard. When you're getting into the amount of time, if Labour were unhappy and they wanted more time in committee, say, you're really into the dark arts of the whips, the usual channels. When I used to report on committee, you would know when the opposition were unhappy that they weren't getting enough time, because you'd start getting members introducing and asking questions about amendments, and then another member popping up and saying, "Oh, my honourable friend makes a very good point, perhaps he'd just like to go into a bit more detail," and you would realise that it was going on later and later and later, and then you would see the whip scurry outside, conversations would be had, and then announcements would be made that maybe an extra day might be found for committee. But at the beginning of a committee, for instance, there will be a programming subcommittee which will determine how long is spent looking at that bill in committee. And of course, the programming subcommittee will have a majority of government members on it. So the government have literally the whip hand when it comes to determining how much time is spent debating bills in the House of Commons. Third reading is usually at the end of report, and that's usually quite short. But that whole situation of the government deciding how much time is spent on legislation changes quite dramatically when you get to the House of Lords. The House of Lords is a self-regulating chamber. The government do not have the power, or do not exercise the power, to introduce things like guillotine motions or knives, or any of those sorts of time restrictions in the House of Lords. Their lordships decide how long they are going to spend looking at legislation. That is why, for instance, the Parliamentary constituencies and AV bill took so long. That's why the Health and Social Care bill took so long. Now, first reading and second reading in the House of Lords are pretty similar. You'll have formality first reading, 2 weeks later you'll have a second reading and general debate on the principles of the bill. In the House of Lords, there is no such thing as a public bill committee. The committee stage of the House of Lords, any member can speak, any member can introduce an amendment. The amendments are not selected by anybody. If a member of the House of Lords wants an amendment to be debated, it will be debated. There is no time limit on the committee stage in the House of Lords. Committee can take a very long time. The Health and Social Care bill took nearly 6 weeks in committee, perhaps more, in the House of Lords. And they can sit through the night, they can sit as long as they like. And when they are unhappy about something, they will. And that question about the opposition perhaps being unhappy about a bill, in the House of Lords, what's very interesting at the moment, in years gone by, the Lords would tend not to try and delay or frustrate a bill that was in the manifesto of the party of government. But because the coalition agreement was drawn up after the general election, there are some members of the House of Lords who feel that they're not obliged to respect that convention. And when you get legislation like the Health and Social Care bill that wasn't in the coalition agreement, then the Lords feel doubly sort of, what's the word I'm looking for, entitled to take their time and spend time looking in detail at legislation and making sure all of it is thoroughly scrutinised. So committee stage can take as long as the Lords think is necessary. Any amendment any member of the Lords wants to be debated will be debated. If they want to vote on an amendment, they will vote on the amendment. Report stage, similarly, can take as long as the Lordships feel is necessary. Even on third reading, amendments can still be introduced. Now, it had always been my impression with third readings that amendments introduced there would be technical. During the consideration of the Welfare Reform Bill, an amendment that had been introduced and defeated in committee was brought back and passed. So it seems to me the Lords, they will make the rules. If they decide they're going to bring an amendment back on third reading, then they'll do so. So very much the key to understanding bills in the Lords is this notion of self-regulation and that their lordships decide. With the Parliamentary Constituencies Bill, after a week of sittings till 4 or 5 in the morning, the leader of the House of Lords, Lord Strathclyde, did threaten to use a guillotine. And this caused horror in the House of Lords, the idea of a guillotine happening. And in the end, the crossbenchers sort of brokered a compromise. But the government do not control the amount of time spent looking at legislation in the Lords. When a bill has come out of the Lords, it will have had many amendments made to it in the Lords. And those amendments must be considered by the House of Commons. Needless to say, this process operates in reverse if the bill has started in the House of Lords. So this is the final stage, the consideration of amendments. If the two houses can't immediately reach agreement, you may get into what's known as ping-pong, where the bill goes backwards and forwards between the two houses until they can agree on the wording of the bill. The longest one, sort of single session of ping pong I ever saw was when the Labour government tried to introduce 90 days detention without trial for terror suspects. That went into 36 hours of ping pong. It started on Thursday morning, it finished on Friday afternoon. It went through the night. More recently, some of the ping pong and things like the Welfare Reform Bill happened over a series of days. So the bill would leave the Commons, go to the Lords on a different day, they would consider the amendments, and it would go back to the Commons on a separate day. If both houses cannot agree, if both houses insist on their version of the bill, you have what is known as double insistence, and the bill will fall. If the bill were to go through that entire process and fall, and the government were then to reintroduce it, and it fell again, they can use the Parliament Act to overrule the House of Lords. They can only do that if the bill has made that journey twice. And it has to have made that journey twice in the same Parliament, that is, the space between two general elections. So if the current government introduced the bill now, it failed, and then they tried to introduce it again after the next general election, if they won re-election, that wouldn't count as the second time. It only would count as its second time if they'd done it again during the same Parliament. Once the bill has made this journey, this complete journey twice, and fallen twice, the government can then overrule the Lords. So that's a power that the House of Commons has. Very rarely comes to that. The last bill to be forced through using the Parliament Act was the Fox Hunting Act, the ban on fox hunting. Generally speaking, the two houses will strive to find some sort of agreement. A lot of the changes that were introduced in the House of Lords will be rejected by the Commons because the government have the majority there. Some will remain. The legal aid bill that went through recently, there was an amendment made in the Lords. The government were trying to withdraw legal aid for sufferers of a particular lung condition called mesothelioma. The Lords decided that wasn't right, and in the end the Commons agreed. The government backed down, and the change was made. So by no means do all the changes made in the House of Lords stick, but generally speaking, a big change to a bill, if it's going to happen, it will happen in the House of Lords. When the two houses agree on the wording of a bill, the bill can then proceed to that final stage of royal assent, where the monarch makes the bill into an act. Now, this is very much a formality. The monarch would not refuse to grant assent to any bill sort of passed in the normal way by Parliament. The monarch has not refused to do that since 1707. I've been asked repeatedly about when would the monarch refuse assent, and as far as I can ascertain from talking to sort of people who know a bit more about constitutional matters than I do, it would seem to be if Parliament were to try and pass a bill that would make someone Prime Minister for life, or abolish general elections, or something like that. And then maybe the monarch could refuse assent. Although my guess is, if Parliament were trying to do that, the monarch would probably already be in the Tower, so it might be a bit late. But as far as I can see, as far as I can ascertain from my limited knowledge of the Constitution, monarchs do not interfere in political matters. They would not refuse royal assent to any bill passed by Parliament in a normal fashion. Public Bill Committees I mentioned. Yes, sorry.
At what point do the parliamentary draftsmen come in?
The parliamentary draftsmen will draft the bill itself. They'll also be responsible for drafting any government amendments to the bill. So if, for instance, someone were to introduce, an opposition member were to introduce an amendment at Public Bill Committee, and the government liked the look of it, they would then go away to the parliamentary draftsmen and say, right, put this into wording that will work in the bill. Just a brief word about Public Bill Committees. I did talk about these. These will be appointed for each bill that goes through Parliament in the House of Commons. They will take written and oral evidence from experts outside Parliament. You'll notice there's an asterisk there. That is because the Finance Bill does not take evidence from oral witnesses. Bills which begin their life in the House of Lords also do not take evidence from oral witnesses. But most bills will have that oral evidence at the beginning of their Public Bill Committee. All bills will have written evidence in the Public Bill Committee.
Just going to add to that, the young Fabians, regarding, I think, the Job Summit, they submitted some oral evidence, no written evidence to a committee earlier this year. We have the opportunity within the think tank ourselves to actually do that sort of work.
Was that to a bill committee or a select committee?
I can't remember.
Okay, I mean, the process is a little different, although the principles are very similar. And this is, in parliamentary terms, a recent innovation. In 2007 it began with bills. But the process is quite similar. With select committees, you would go to the select committee itself. With bill committees, there's a unit in Parliament called the scrutiny unit, and you can go and approach them and submit written evidence. These bills are supposed to examine bills clause by clause, although, as I said earlier, they don't always get the time that they might like. Members of the committee can ask for changes by tabling amendments, and the bill will then report its findings to the main chamber. If you want to submit written evidence to a bill committee, the aim is to give context rather than to propose amendments. There's nothing to stop you speaking to individual MPs about proposing amendments, and indeed the Law Society, among others, often do exactly that. But written evidence is not designed for that, and you can speak to the scrutiny unit for guidance on that. These slides, by the way, I'll be sending to Alex, so don't worry if you can't jot down all the contact details right away, but those are the contact details for the scrutiny unit. You can track any legislation on the Parliament website, including the current finance bill. There's a full A to Z list of every single bill. That includes private members' bills, the works. But you've got some drop-down menus, which you can't see on that list, but there are drop-down menus which will enable you to sort of siphon out the private members' bills and zoom in on the government bills if you would like. And then each government bill will have its own page that will look very much like that one. And on that page, just to recap, you can find the bill itself, all the different versions of the bill as it goes through. You can find any briefing documents that the Commons or Lords Library has made about the bill. You can get email alerts about the stages of the bill. One last plug for my old job. These links here to the different stages will take you to the Hansard report of that legislation. Now, that may be of specific interest to you if you're studying or following a particular bill, but they also have a legal force. If there's any dispute after a bill is enacted about what the bill was intended to do, then the Hansard record is the arbiter. What the ministers say on the record in Parliament a bill is meant to do has actual legal force. That would be used to determine what a bill was intended to do in the case of a dispute over its intention. So actually having a Hansard record of what ministers say about a particular piece of legislation, a particular provision within a bill, is actually quite useful because it gives you an idea of what that bill should be meant to do.
Is that just for ministers, or say if someone just makes an amendment?
For ministers. So if a minister is questioned in the bill committee, why are you doing this? What's this clause for? And they say, well, it will do this. And then later on there's a dispute as to whether it was supposed to do that or not. That has legal force. There's a court case called Pepper versus Hart that we turn on that. So that's really all I wanted to say about the general principles of legislation. Has anyone got any questions at that stage?
I think you might have said it, but can you tell me why you would start a bill either in the Lords or the Commons? Or like, why would you start it in the Lords?
Well, there are two reasons, really. First of all, the governments don't want all the bills that they've got to start in the Commons at the beginning of the year and then all end up in the Lords at the end of the year. So there's a pragmatic reason. But the separation is usually, if the government feel a bill has consensual support, perhaps a bill is a non-partisan, non-party political matter, they would tend to introduce it in the Lords. The Lords is often also used for bills that have a constitutional import, because the Lords see that as very much their sort of bailiwick. But of course, one of the bills that we're expecting this year is the House of Lords Reform Bill. And I would imagine the government will introduce that in the Commons, because they may need to use the Parliament Act to get it through. So, yeah, it's generally speaking, if the government feel that the bill is contentious or there are going to be any difficulties with it, they'll introduce it.
Can all MPs sort of speak at report stage and sort of third reading, even if they haven't contributed to the Parliament committee or second reading?
Correct, but I would say with third reading, although in principle anybody can speak, it's usually pretty short. If you were to watch a third reading debate, it's usually just the Minister and the Shadow Minister, although other members can intervene and speak if they want. But yeah, the whole point of the report is it's the first opportunity that any member has to table an amendment, because they may well have not been on the Public Bill Committee, so it's actually designed for that very purpose. That's one of the reasons. Yeah.
How many bills can they get into one session?
Well, it very much depends what kind of bills you're talking about. When the government nationalised Northern Rock, that went through all of those stages in 48 hours. Because it was emergency legislation. So, in theory, the government could be passing, 3 or 4 bills a week. In practice, I think, 30 bills in a session is a good number. 40 is an awful lot. When I started in Hansard, it was just after the 2001 election, and we were really stretched. I think there was a good 30 to 40 pieces of legislation in that session. That's quite a lot.
So when they talk about House of Lords reform taking up a lot of time, they could theoretically make sure it doesn't take up much time at all if they wanted.
They could. I mean, always be very wary of politicians saying, "Oh, this is distracting us from the real issues." I mean, Parliament can walk and chew gum at the same time. If the House of Lords reform ends up taking an awfully long time, it's because members want to speak about it for an awfully long time. So they're really masters of their own destiny, especially the Lords themselves. I mean, that's the interesting factor of the House of Lords reform. But the House of Lords has to agree to its own abolition. As you can imagine, they'll probably have quite a lot to say about that. But yeah, I mean, I'm a little sceptical about this argument that we're not going to be able to deal with the current economic situation because of House of Lords reform. Any other general questions at this point? Yeah.
What's the reason behind the draft bills? Why did they choose to go that way?
Yeah, I mean, that was something that I'm not sure if it began with the 1997-2001 Labour government. It certainly accelerated with that government. And pre-legislative scrutiny, the amount of it increased during the Labour tenure. And it was one of those things that actually was welcomed by all parties. I think, generally speaking, everybody seemed very happy with this as a development. And the reason for it really was, I think, where legislation was not seen as party political, and particularly when it was seen as dealing with sort of quite complex issues of law, as a way of trying to get things right, without having to go back and constantly revise legislation. And the Marine Bill I mentioned, that dealt with so many different aspects of law. It was dealing with things like what constitutes territorial waters. It was dealing with flood defences, marine conservation. So many different issues, so many different stakeholders, so many different groups who were interested in it. I think it just made logical sense for it to go through pre-legislative scrutiny. And if you look at the draft care and support bill, or rather what's going to be in that bill, you'll see that again. There are many different groups that are going to want to talk about that. And the government are going to want to get them on side before they push ahead with the legislation. The other thing to think about as well, sometimes when legislation deals with something sensitive, that actually it's good for governments to make sure they're talking to people and listening to them first, rather than just pushing ahead like a bull in a china shop.